Dun, dun. Oh. Welcome once again to another episode of In the Library of Graphic Literature, but the special edition of my comic book DNA Part 2. Yay! Of course, I'm your host, Wallace Ryan. I'm here by myself tonight. Probably be shooting another episode with Luna later on tonight. Got a lot of new books, but I wanted to throw in another comic book DNA feature because I'm going to follow this right up till modern times. So right now we are in my comic book DNA, the first lost years. So what it was when I was in my, I guess 7, 8, 9, I sort of wandered away from reading like a lot of comics. I still read comics now, but not as much as I would read them later on. So this was sort of an in-between period. I would still pick up comics here and there, and I would still read them. As a matter of fact, funny enough, I even joined the Altar Boys because they used to have this cabinet filled with comics there. So I was in it for the comics right from the start. Anyway, so this was, as you can picture, late 60s, and I was, I'd picked up a few comics by this point. Like I say, like the Kurt Swan, Steve Ditko, Kane were all big things for me. But I was mainly a DC person. Never really did except for a few exceptions, which I start to delve into here, and of course, in the next episode we'll delve in completely. A bit of Marvel. But meanwhile, in the late 60s, one of the big ones that came to me and was, of course, my favorite artist at the time, Steve Ditko. Of course, there was The Creeper, which was one of my favorite of his. I always like to, this is a great thing, and I actually had this issue, because I can remember reading this, and it was just like, oh my god, this is cool. And I knew once again that this was the artist who did Spider-Man. And it was interesting because I wasn't a big Spider-Man fan, but at the time I liked Ditko. And he was one of the first, along with Kane, in terms of artists who I could recognize their artwork. Mainly it was his hands. Let alone the face and all that, his hands and knuckles, dead giveaway. Of course, another one of my favorite of his titles, besides The Creeper, was Hawk and Dove. And Hawk and Dove, it was a great series. I think they really pooched the idea when they redid it in the 80s or 90s, where they came back and it was Hawk and Girl Dove, as I call her. But it didn't work as well, because the whole thing with the Hawk and Dove to me was that these were brothers. So when they changed it really took the dynamic. Because in the early ones, I mean, Hawk, of course, was the Hawk. He was the warlike of the two, while the Dove was more peaceful. So, I mean, he'd be the type of guy, while the Hawk was kicking butt, he'd be trying to talk to the people and see if they, okay, do we have to fight like this? Can't we just come together? But yeah, loved Hawk and Dove. Really, really cool title. And like I say, at the time, I wasn't like accumulating comics, but I'd still read them every so often. And these were ones I'd find on the shelf, or I can't remember where I seen the Hawk and the Dove ones. I think my Aunt Marie and my Aunt Vera might have dropped those off to us. Actually, my Aunt Vera and my Uncle Aiden, they were great, because they'd take the comics that their kids were finished with and bring them down to the edge of the street where we lived, and so we'd get all these comics for free. And the rest of my family weren't really interested, so they were almost like, would become instantly almost my comics. But I would still buy comics here and there, but I would read them and then they would go by the wayside, or I don't know. Like I say, it was a lost time for me. One of the ones I do remember from around that era, though, was and this was around the start of a foray into Marvel for me. It wasn't too far, though, because I only bought that issue. I didn't buy any of the other ones that followed, whatever. But I kind of liked it. There was something about it. It was well, it was for 25 cents too. It was a big comic, and it looked kind of cool, very different. To me, it seemed like different from what Marvel was, and I always loved that corner artwork there. Very cool, Kirby's, of course, and but yeah, it just seemed like an interesting concept, and that Galactus guy they talk about and all that, he seemed to be a real menace. so I read it, and another one, and I'd seen this. This is another Marvel one too. Of course, was the Gil Kane Marvel when he came back to try to revive it, and specifically, of course, the big one for this and for everyone from way back then. This was after he got his new costume. And this Katang. I'd seen this appear like in magazines. I think Graphis was one of the magazines, like art magazines and all that. That was a common page that you would see when they'd be talking about comics of the day at the time. And or this one, which to me is one of my favorite Captain Marvel splash pages. This was it was the return of the Captain Marvel, and at the time when I first started to read it, it was just like, Jesus, this is the same Captain Marvel. And then of course I see the Jan Rog involved there, and then it was just like, okay, this guy must somehow be related to the Captain America I bought a few years earlier, who I did like, and it was just like, oh, I kind of like this newer Captain Marvel. Meanwhile, of course, back at DC, I was buying one of my favorite titles. Was actually the Justice League of America, and I liked it right from the start. And in particular, and I can still remember to this day, I bought this in the store at the time, but I'd also bought it. I bought it years later in it was a little bookstore that carried some comics along with, all the other used books and stuff like that. And of course, I was down there all the time, and I can remember being down there one rainy fall or winter evening. It's actually kind of rainy out there tonight. Kind of like tonight. And I can remember seeing this comic in particular. Now, I love the Justice League and the Justice Society because it was just like, they were like it was like multiverse, really, for the first time. So you had this Justice League and then this Justice League from another Earth, who were really cool. And for some reason, I kind of liked that. I think it was the same reason I liked Green Lantern, is that there was more than just one Green Lantern. There was like a Green Lantern for every planet. So I thought that was cool. Meanwhile, the other one that I remember reading at the time, and a lot of people, I don't know what it is, they don't speak fondly of the new Wonder Woman. And I think what it was, a lot of people objected to the fact that they thought of this as depowering Wonder Woman at the time. And basically turned her into sort of almost an Emma Peel, almost more like a secret agent type of person. And she met up with this guy I Ching, who was kind of like her guru her sensei for learning her martial arts skills. And at the time, I mean, like I say, I kind of liked it because it was, I mean, we at this point, people don't realize too what it was like in terms of people who read the old Wonder Woman and all that. The old Wonder Woman by that point had become stale. I mean, it was the late 60s. People were changing, they were trying to change a lot of stuff here and there, and there wasn't much, I guess they figured they could do with Wonder Woman in terms of how can you change Wonder Woman. She was fabulous. She had great costume, sort of a great backup story, great side characters, had everything going for it. How could you mess that up? Well, they did. They took her powers away. But at the time, I kind of liked it because it fit in with a lot of stuff that was going on at DC at the time. DC was starting to come back because during the 60s, DC had been really pummeled by Marvel. I mean, I read DC, and I was even willing to admit this. It was they were the underdog, but they started to come across with stuff like that. The Justice League was a great title. Diana Prince, and even into and then into stuff like the Spectre and all that with Neal Adams. And the arrival of Neal Adams was, to me, it was because I can remember reading some of his stuff, especially one story that he'd done for World's Finest, I think it was, where there was this Superman anti-Superman squad or whatever. Anyway, it was just like, geez, this Neal Adams guy's good, this DC's really starting to pull their stuff together. And along with that was, of course, the arrival of Jim Aparo, in my mind, at DC. And this collection actually has Jim Aparo and Neal Adams, has some of the Dead Men, which I have in a separate edition. But the great thing about, there's a couple of stories. Well, it was backups of the Adams story, and look at that great Neal Cardy cover there. I mean, my God! But I mean, Adams, it was his Aquaman at the time was just like, he really brought it back from the brink, and I think it was those covers too, which were really cool. But I mean, he did for Aquaman what Neal Adams, in my mind, did for Batman. And what Neal Adams also did for Dead Man, a title he took over from the first issue was this one here, and it was Strange Adventures, and it wasn't, the art was Carmine Infantino, inked by, I think it was George Russo's or someone, and it was terrible. And so eventually Neal Adams took over. Now this was a redone version of the same comic. He just went over it in that new coloring way of his, basically changing everything. Now we go back to, but this was the one I wanted to show you. This, I can still remember this being on the stand and buying it, because it was just like, my God, look at this, all the faces there. This was dramatic, and the inside, the figures were great. It was just like, I don't know who this Neal Adams guy is, but I love his panels. He's so realistic too. So I mean, this was the start. It was one of the things that was getting me back into the comics, because meanwhile I'd started to draw seriously again. I drew as a kid, but I began to seriously draw when I was 8 and 9 and stuff like that. And we'll end off today with, of course, this is some of the other Neal Adams stuff that drew me to him. Was his covers actually on the Phantom Stranger. And of course, not only his covers on the Phantom Stranger, but the inside artwork by Jim Aparo. Let's see, oh, right here. Which, I mean, his covers were really cool. Look at that. And eventually, I kept collecting, and even when I came back and began to collect more and more comics, I actually did collect the later, like these later episodes of the Phantom Stranger. But the Phantom Stranger was one of the comics, along with a lot of the other mystery comics and of the early 70s. Hang on a second. Psst, knock it off! Sorry, that's my cat trying to get in here. The early horror comics from House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Tales of the Unexpected. One moment, please. Okay. I apologize for that. She's quite insistent when she's trying to get into the studio. Anyway, into the horror titles I started to get into, because I'd be picking up those and reading them, even sometimes reading them on the shelf and all that, and even started to dip my toes into other things. I'd start to see comic magazines start to appear in the 70s, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But this episode of my comic book DNA was about the first lost years for me. It happens and it happens throughout any collector's artist's life, especially collector's life, because when you first fall in love with comics as a kid, goes right up until I guess around. I was unusual because I started picking up when a lot of people were dropping it off, like 10 or 11. They're getting into sports and stuff like that. And meanwhile, I was getting into comics. But even with comics, in terms of collecting, even though I was starting to draw them, I didn't start to really collect them until, a few years into the 70s. And it was once it started, I just couldn't stop ever again, except for a couple of times. But as a collector, I found then in my late teens, early 20s, I'd started dropping off a lot on superhero stuff. I was picking up heavy metal and all kinds of great stuff that was coming out late 70s, early 80s. And then when I finished art school in the mid 80s, then I started collecting again. And then, next thing you're working, you get married, whatever. So there's a lull again. But then once you're married for a year or two, you start buying comics again, and from then on, it's been consistent in terms of I've been collecting them, except for in the early 2000s. There was I had a little bit of lull there, and then picked it up again in the 2010s and the 20-teens, and still do to this day, and which leads me right up to this show itself. Anyway, that being said, keep an eye out now. Hopefully this week we will have an episode with me and the mysterious Luna. Ooh. She's off at work, but I got a stack of new books which have been dying to get through. So sooner or later, and I'm hoping this week, because I wanted to do a 2-episode week, and I'm going to try to do a lot more of my comic book DNA too over the next few weeks to fill in between if we don't have anything new. I always want to have something for you lovely, lovely, wonderfuls out there, and this is one of them. Meanwhile, for me, it's back to work here for me. I'm working on some comic book stuff, and I'm going to go have a cup of tea, and then I guess post this. I think I think I will post it. Anyway, it's a nice rainy day out there. I can hear cars on the street out there. I can hear the cats struggling outside there. And all that being said, I gotta go. I love you, people. Thanks for having me over. Bye.